NBC, NPR, and PBS, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, we are glad that he's not with any of them tonight, but that he is here with us. So friends, please help me welcome Mr. Roger Severino.
Thank you, John. So David Aycock led us with the Pledge of Allegiance and brought up a great point that under God was a fairly new edition, 1954. And I had worked on defending the Pledge of Allegiance and the phrase under God when I was at the Beckett Fund, so I learned some of the history of what went on. The Knights of Columbus, a fraternal order, Catholic men, would add it at the end of their meetings in the 50s to remind us what America is all about. And if you recall, that was the height of the Cold War, where it was a civilizational conflict. And really, the future of America, in many ways, was at stake. The future of Western civilization was at stake. The principles of the Declaration of Independence was at stake. And it was the materialist, atheistic vision of government control of the communist bloc, or Western liberal democracies under God on the other side. We're at the same kind of moment. I think only by God's providence we have not had the major social left-right conflicts that we've seen rack other countries. We had the French Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Spanish Civil War. All of these atheistic socialist movements that led to incredible bloodshed and suffering, we've been spared of so far. And I think we've been spared in part because we've always remembered those foundational principles, that it all begins with the proper understanding of human nature, that if men were angels, governments would not be necessary, but we also have to respect the sovereignty of God. Things turned for the better after Donald Trump came into office. One of the most unexpected changes came from his election and his commitment to defend unborn human life and the principles of religious liberty. He was the most pro-life president in history who installed the most pro-religious freedom administration in history. It was unexpected because he didn't come from that world, he didn't go through the grassroots, but God provides in many different ways. And he empowered people who did have those backgrounds to do the sorts of things that would stave off this oncoming tide of secularism. So my talk is going to be structured where I'm going to speak about the achievements we did, how they've been changed and rolled back with lightning speed, and what are some of the greater threats on the horizon, and of course, what we can do about it. Now, first, I want to say that NC Family is one such organization that can do something about it and has done tremendous work for years working in the vineyard to help out. So keep in mind that there'll be some dark moments, but there is still hope at the end of it. So let's start with some of the light moments. It was a beautiful day in March, right after the president was sworn in. It was at the White House Rose Garden. The sky was crystal clear, and it was the president's talk announcing his executive order on religious freedom. In the crowd were the Little Sisters of the Poor, and I hope you've all heard their story. And the president said, "We are finally going to get the government foot off of your necks." Because the government under Obama, through Obamacare, had imposed a contraceptive mandate, which Congress had never voted for. It went through the administrative process, and it was imposed on all employers of a certain size that they must provide contraceptive coverage, including nuns for fellow nuns. So I don't know how much you know about Catholic doctrine, but nuns generally don't need contraceptives. But it didn't matter what their religious beliefs were on the question. The government said, you must comply, regardless. And in fact, they said they weren't religious enough, because some religious groups were allowed, but not the Little Sisters of the Poor. in part because they served everyone, and their mission was to serve the dying poor, so they would not die alone, so they would know Christ's love would be with them in their final moments. And they didn't say only Catholics. They would allow everybody. But the government said, well, because you're open up to other people, now you have to follow our rules. Well, the president was announcing that we were going to get rid of that burden on their religious freedom. We would stop hounding them and threaten literally to shut them down and assess millions of dollars in fines just to make a point. That was what the government was doing. They just wanted to make a point that there would be no exceptions because they wanted this to be universal. That is a bureaucratic mindset that I encountered time and again when I worked at HHS. I was in the bowels of the beast. And it's something that came up in other things that the president rolled back. The Mexico City policy. This was designed by bureaucrats to fund overseas advocacy for abortion as a method of family planning. That was undone very early. Title X, the funding of contraceptives for low-income persons. We issued a rule that would make sure it was not being used to subsidize abortion clinics and their overhead. Now, the American people have all sorts of views on the abortion question. It is generally pro-life, especially among the young. But wherever there is profound agreement, it's on this. You don't force people to perform or assist in abortions, and you don't force people to participate in them, and you don't force people to have insurance coverage for abortion. If some people do it, well, they're going to do it, but don't force others to participate. That has wide majorities of Americans that support that concept. So you don't fund Planned Parenthood when you're trying to do family planning projects. Well, of course, the Obama administration was. And we said something very simple. Planned Parenthood, you say that abortion is a mere teensy-weensy bit of your activities. They say it's 3%. Well, you have a choice. Separate that 3% from your family planning activities, financially and physically, and don't refer people who come in to abortions, because that's barred by federal law. They refused, and they dropped out of the program. And of course, there were others that took up the slack. And that was because of the rule we put in place. We also ended the practice of secret abortion billing. Under Obamacare, unfortunately, one of the compromises that led to it coming into play were a few people, a couple holdouts, they were Democrats at the time, said, well, the best we can do to protect life is at least have separate billing. So if somebody has abortion as part of their coverage, they get a separate bill in the mail, they pay for it separately, so you have that separation between federally funded programs and not. Well, under Obama, that requirement was gone. It could have been buried in plan documents, so people wouldn't know that they were funding their own kids' abortions. Because under Obamacare, it's up to 25 years of age. You could have a daughter in college having abortions under your plan and the parents paying for it and not ever even knowing that they were paying for it. California just passed a law requiring that hidden charge where insurance companies cannot tell the parents that there was an abortion performed on their daughters, right? So we were rolling things back, and we're also doing some things on this question of gender identity. Doctors under Obamacare, you see this recurring theme? Doctors under Obamacare were being required to perform sex reassignment surgeries regardless of their best medical judgment and regardless of any religious objections they would have. And this would apply even to minors. So long as you had a psychologist issue a doctor's note saying that it is medically indicated for this person to have this surgery or this teenager to have puberty blockers, etc., you as a doctor would have to do it. If you could do a hysterectomy because that's part of your practice to cure cancer, you'd have to do a hysterectomy even if there's no diseased tissue whatsoever if somebody has a gender identity issue. And more than that, insurance companies would have to cover it. contrary to the state of science. It was an ideological move that, of course, hurt religious freedom. We undid that. We said that sex is male and female, biologically, binary, based on genetics, caused an incredible uproar, but it was the right thing to do. And of course, we had strong religious liberty protections in place as well. And on the positive side, we didn't just roll back things. I had the pleasure of launching a conscience and religious freedom division, staffed with career professionals, 18 of which we hired that have civil service protections. They can't be fired on a whim, to do something that's rather common sense. We have civil rights laws. They have to be enforced. We do it with every other civil right. We do it on race, sex, national origin, disability, age, color, but we don't do it for religious freedom and religious discrimination. So, this is one lesson. If the bureaucracy is already there, let's at least turn the bureaucracy to good ends. We launched this division, tremendous fanfare. The president himself announced our first regulatory effort to provide regulatory support to about 24 conscience protection laws that had not been enforced for years. The complaints started rolling in, and we had a case of a nurse who was called by our hospital one weekend to assist with what she thought was the after effects of a miscarriage. She had told her bosses at the University of Vermont Medical Center that she could not in good faith assist in an abortion. It was contrary to her religious beliefs. She entered the practice of medicine to save lives, not end them. And they had respected her beliefs for a time. But on this one particular weekend, they called her in under false pretenses, and then the doctor turned to her and said, "Please don't hate me." Because it was clear this was not a miscarriage. This was an abortion of a living child. And she raised her objections and said, "Well, you know, I can't do this." But they said, "You're the only nurse here. You can't abandon your patient. This is your obligation." Her job was on the line. Her license to practice medicine was on the line. So faced with this horrible pressure, she gave in and has been scarred ever since. And she turned to us at the Conscience Division, at the Office of Civil Rights at HHS, seeking help. And we issued a notice of violation, saying that this was a clear violation of law. It is as clear as it gets. We issued a referral to DOJ, which then filed a lawsuit so that they would not receive federal funds, and they had to shape up. We provided that help. And that's just one example of the things we were doing. We went after the state of California for forcing near universal abortion insurance coverage. We issued our notice of violation and followed it up with cutting $200 million in Medicaid funds to California for violating long-standing federal laws. We went after California again in the NIFLA versus Becerra case for going after pregnancy resource centers because those pregnancy resource centers would not refer for abortions. Think about that. The state of California was requiring pro-life resource centers to tell the women they're helping where to get abortions for free. And they were threatened with being shut down if they wouldn't speak those words. That is a form of totalitarianism. That's what the Supreme Court said. We issued our notice of violation as well. The Supreme Court also issued a ruling enjoining it. I'm proud of what we did in the Trump administration. It took tremendous effort. It was not easy. And it was a fight on the outside, enemies on all sides. There were opponents on the inside that were trying to block what we were doing. But we were doing the right thing, and we stuck it through. And I look back with pride. We left it all on the table. And we did everything we could for life and religious freedom. And that shows how important personnel is, starting at the top with who's president and who fills in every other position from the cabinet on down. That is the difference maker. Support from the outside was fantastic where we got it. That's an important piece, but you need those people willing to step up and take the hits for the right reasons. Now, that was then, unfortunately. Where are we now? Mexico City policy, reversed. Separate billing and hidden abortion bills, reversed. Title 10, separate financial and physical separation so we don't fund the overhead of Planned Parenthood anymore, and the forced referrals, reversed Monday. We had the nurse in the Vermont case forced to assist in an abortion. The lawsuit was dropped by the U.S. Department of Justice. She has been absolutely abandoned. Javier Becerra, he was the Attorney General of California when we cut the $200 million in Medicaid funds. He was the Becerra in NIFLA versus Becerra. He's now in charge of the Medicaid fund. He is the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. He was my main antagonist when I was at HHS, enforcing the laws against him. Now he's running HHS. The $200 million penalty is gone. It was revoked as well. Now we had a Supreme Court decision on NIFLA versus Becerra. So unless he's going to defy the Supreme Court, we'll see what happens there. But on every single step, he's been pushing hard to undo all the good we did for life and religious freedom. On the transgender mandate, we issued regulations to affirm human sexuality as one person, one sex for male, one sex for female, based on the science. By an act of fiat, through a press release, they said they're going to ignore that regulation and going to start enforcing those same rules that had already been struck down by a district court and undone by our efforts. Stroke of a pen, we're now enforcing it. That is a form of lawlessness. We followed the rules. And a little bit about the administrative process where you all could get involved, and encourage you all to get involved, is in the rulemaking process. We issued a conscience rule, we issued the Title 10 rule, we issued the separate billing rule, we issued the rollback of the transgender mandate through rules. They have the force and effect of laws. We are governed in your daily activities by rules. The vaccine mandate that the president has announced he's going to do wasn't passed by Congress. It's going to come through OSHA, the Office of Safety, Health, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Safety and health. Where in the statute does it say they have the power to impose a nationwide mandate? But they're going to do it through rules, which means you have an opportunity to comment on the rulemaking process. We received over 200,000 rules on gender identity mandate rollback. Members of the public need to get involved. Regulations.gov is the website where you track these regulations coming through. Anybody and everybody should submit comments. By law, the agencies are required to consider the comments, and if they don't, it could be ruled illegal. If you don't raise an argument, an objection in particular, they don't have to answer it, and you lose your opportunity to raise it later. Unless you have a constitutional claim, you can't waive that. But you have other claims, you lose it. It's use it or lose it. So I do encourage all of you to become aware of the regulatory process. At EPPC, I have the HHS Accountability Project that I'm the director of, and we are mobilizing folks to get involved. So follow us. Follow me on Twitter. Follow what we do to be informed so you could submit your comments. Every single one counts. The left is exceedingly good at this. That's one of the things I learned being in the government. The left knows the levers of government. They know every trick in the book of how to move things through and how to cause trouble for people who are trying to do the right thing, how to slow things down. All of those things matter. All of those things matter. Now, one of the bright spots, we still have the Supreme Court and a conservative majority. Thank God. That was Trump's biggest legacy by far. He put pro-life, pro-religious freedom, originalist judges on the court. and I expect good things to come out of that. However, we can't rely on the Supreme Court. So much of our daily life is governed by what the federal government does through the agencies. So get involved there. Where do I see things going? Well, the biggest threat I see, as if it isn't bad enough, all the things that have been undone, there's still more I see on the horizon. I think the scariest words in the English language now are public health emergency. Those three words. So much nefarious actions could come of that. And I think COVID is testing the nature of our way of life. Now, I don't mean simply the horrible health consequences of the hundreds of thousands of deaths. We could survive that as a country. We've survived worse. It's what's going to happen to our institutions, how we deal with each other, and more importantly, how our government deals with us. Early on in the outbreak, this was March 2020, and I had seen all the internal figures of how bad it was going to be when I was at HHS. And I was there when the guidance was being rolled out on houses of worship and what the restrictions would be put in place, etc. And my local church, like every single other one, closed their doors for parishioners. And it was such a shock, sad, and tragic. But I had never missed Sunday Mass, and my family had never missed it. So we showed up, and we're out in the parking lot, and we piped in the liturgy, and we were in violation of the law, because in Virginia at the time, they had limits, even on outdoor worship services. And I thought, well, what's more important? This is my opportunity to impart an important lesson to my children as to what really matters. And if I were to be fined or arrested, so be it. I would volunteer to be the first. It'd be all over the news. It'd be great. It'd bring attention to the issue that there are some things that are worth standing up to the government for. And this was absolutely one of them. So I didn't get arrested, but we continued in defiance of the law until they started relaxing some of the restrictions. And we never missed. But that was an uncommon story. Unfortunately, most houses of worship actually gave in. Now, of course, you have to render under Caesar what is Caesar's, but you have to render under God what is God's. And the church is God's. So, there were a few brave houses of worship that did stand up. And when I was at HHS, I had massive debates over what these strictures were going to be. And if you look at what actually came out, at first, CDC issued guidance on whether or not you could have communion in a chalice, on whether or not you could pass around hymnals, on whether you could chant or sing and praise God with your own voice. And they reversed it because a couple of us fought back. And we said, this is a violation of what we stand for as a country. There are some things more important than health, and it's our religious liberty. And that was an incredible fight, but we did win. So if you look at the guidance that came out, religious organizations were treated differently. And there were some suggestions on what you can do, but nothing in the framing of a mandate. The phrase Jewish Sabbath was included in the earlier guidance on giving advice to Orthodox Jews on how they could get around restrictions on use of electronic devices in the Sabbath. Now, the phrase Jewish Sabbath should never appear in a CDC document, but it was there, and nobody was sufficiently outraged about it. And it was behind the scenes, I'm fighting with CDC, they're leaking to CNN, and at some of the inside stuff that we had to deal with. But we eventually prevailed. However, the mandate still came through at the state level. Governor still did it anyway. And those churches that did stand up won at the Supreme Court. They actually won. And that's, of course, because President Trump put good people in the Supreme Court. So, what next with COVID? If we were willing to give up on being able to worship, what is next? Now, of course, we have the vaccination mandates coming down. All in the name of public health emergency. One of the cases being cited is Jacobson versus Massachusetts from 1907 or 1905, saying that in a smallpox outbreak in Massachusetts, the state was able to impose a vaccine mandate and because of the circumstances of the time. Now, that case has not really been cited much. It was about a local smallpox outbreak, which is a very different sort of disease, and it didn't involve the federal power. But that case was cited in a famous other case in 1927, where the question was, does the government have the power to forcibly sterilize people that are deemed unfit genetically? The case was Buck versus Bell. And the Supreme Court looked at it and said, in the name of health, we should do this. We looked at the Jacobs case. If you could do it for a vaccine, of course you could do it to preserve the stock of the American people. And this is a quote from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. He said, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And we as a nation have been living that down ever since, all in the name of health. What else came out of pursuing public health? Well, abortion legalization started through the notion that abortion was therapeutic. It's good for a woman's health. If you read Roe v. Wade and its companion case, Doe v. Bolton, you could have abortion up until the moment of birth to preserve the woman's health, which of course is defined to include social factors, age, and pretty much anything any abortionist is willing to say could affect a woman's well-being, because the phrase well-being was used in the decision. In the name of health. Removing healthy sex organs in children. Health. It even moves into questions like assisted suicide. Your health is so bad, you are better off dead. Abortion of people with Down syndrome. Better off not living any longer because they're going to have a bad health outcome. So, wherever you may stand on the vaccine, and there are all sorts of views on the question, consider the implications of giving so much power to the federal government in the name of a public health emergency that will not be ending anytime soon. I was there when we were discussing when would we call this off. It's not going to be called off probably for years as an official declared public health emergency. The question of religious exemptions is right now being debated on vaccines. Of course, the only vaccines available in the United States were derived or tested on aborted fetal cell lines. HEK293 was a cell line derived from an aborted child in the 60s, and they took the kidney, that's what the K stands for, and replicated it specifically to find the freshest type of tissue that they thought would be helpful and untainted to test drugs on. So that cell line was used for the development or testing of the available vaccines. There are people of sincere religious belief who want nothing to do with being part of that grisly business of abortion and don't want to benefit from a child's death, no matter how remote, no matter how far back, and don't want to legitimize the practice. Others say, well, because of my particular health, it may be justified. My point to you is that it always requires a justification. You cannot be agnostic and neutral about the question of the origin of what happened with these vaccines. There was a child that died, and that child's tissues were used for the vaccines that are out there now. Don't just ignore it. Face it. Come to a conclusion. Those that conclude that they don't want the vaccine are now being hounded out of public life. Religious accommodations are part of our nation's founding traditions. Even George Washington exempted Quakers from the American Revolutionary War when our very republic was at stake. And that tradition has kept on throughout. But now, because we have the winds of secularism blowing, when people don't respect under God anymore, they see religious objections as a threat to society. Because those who are in favor of the vaccine mandates, in their mind, think there is no other counter-argument, people who are against it are actually evil and deserve to be treated that way. And if we lose our religious freedom in the name of public health on this, it's pretty much over on all the other issues we care about. Coercion on abortion is easy. And it won't stop there. So I recommend to you to become involved on this question, even if you think that it's morally justified in this circumstance for people to accept vaccines. Stand up for people who have sincere religious beliefs against it. Because what we're seeing, even from the Coast Guard itself, is a new form of religious inquisition where we have secular bodies actually having notes on scriptures and saying if a service member comes in and says an objection on this based on, say, the commandment that thou shalt not kill, here's a counter-argument based on some other scripture. This is our government now, for the first time in who knows how long, delving into scriptures and coming into religious conclusions in order to counteract people's religious freedom. That should be absolutely frightening to everyone here. Businesses are doing the exact same thing. And it's not because they care about the truth of the scriptures. It's not because they care. I'd feel a lot better if they actually cared about the truth of the scriptures. Let's have a debate about that. But that's not the reason. It's because they want to find any excuse to discredit people of faith and to exclude them and safely label them as the enemy. Now, that's the state of where we are now. Things are not hopeless. We still have a Supreme Court that I think is going to overrule Roe versus Wade. We still have states stepping into the gap and pushing back on all of these issues. The shining light of the Supreme Court has been we haven't lost a religious freedom case in now coming on to decades, and I expect that to continue. So there is hope. But the next couple of years, they're going to be rough. They're going to be rough. But I have hope no matter what. When I was in the Trump administration, and after the election, I expected we'd be where we are now. I didn't feel bad then, and I don't feel bad now. Because we're not called to be successful, we're called to be faithful. Because the fight is already won. Our Lord and Savior shut it all on the cross for us. Christ won the battle. But that does not mean the battle's over for us. We have to step into the breach, be happy warriors, and keep on fighting. Thank you.
Thank you. So Roger has been gracious enough to agree to a little Q&A and thought you all might be interested in that. I've got a couple questions for you before, and we're going to kind of spread apart, not for COVID reasons, but so our microphones don't go woo, woo. So, but Roger, thank you. Talk about a frontline warrior. You absolutely are one. I'm getting feedback. And at levels that, many of us could really not comprehend or have experienced. But I'd love to hear, and thank you for sharing about where your true hope comes from, because I think We all share that, but these are concerning times, and what you've shared is definitely very concerning to us. It's a heavy thing to think about and to know what the path ahead is going to look like. But I would love for you to share a little bit just personally about your background, your upbringing, and how that sort of informs why and how you do what you do.
Well, I grew up in Rosemead, California, a very diverse part just outside of LA. Poor. My mom is actually an orphan, and my dad came from Colombia with my mom first, got enough money, brought my mom over. I was born here. And my mom's prayers and my dad's hard work, and they stuck together, whereas most of my friends and classmates had very bad life outcomes. I ended up going to Harvard Law School. But I didn't return to the faith until law school. So I was a late bloomer, wandering in the wilderness. I had a general sense of right and wrong, but it's very different when you jump in and you don't look back. So that's when I came back to the faith then. And ever since then, I've been committed for the most important issues. And I have, for some odd reason, have been attracted to the hardest fights possible. I don't know exactly why that is, but if it's abortion, okay, I'll do that. Same-sex marriage, okay, I'll jump into that. Transgender issues, sure. I don't know exactly where that comes from, but by the grace of God, I've been able to do some good on all of those issues. And unbeknownst to me, all of the things that I was doing in my life and education, in retrospect, it was God preparing me for my time at HHS, because it all came together. And it wasn't just me. We were able to accomplish so much in such a short time. And not just on all of these issues I spoke about, but on building bridges with the left, on disability rights. We did more on disability rights in 4 years under Trump than 8 years under Obama. And the people on the left know that. I've had New York Times acknowledge me for that. New York Times, right? And the disability rights groups, they acknowledge it. Why? Because I'm pro-life. And I believe in the fundamental dignity of all. And I found that common ground with folks on that issue. And it's trying to live a Christ-like approach to everything. Actually loving your enemies. Which first you have to acknowledge we have enemies, right? They're actually enemies out to destroy you metaphorically, hopefully not physically, but we did get death threats, but, out to get you, yet we must still love them. And, I've had one of the leading transgender activists over my house for dinner, right? To help build those bridges. And even that sort of outreach makes it hard for them to actually continue hating you if you have that human connection.
So would you say that going to Harvard Law School should produce many, many more Christians?
Yeah.
People who are forced to renew their faith or move completely away from it.
It'll make you a stronger Christian, absolutely.
One thing I would like to ask you too, and then I'd like to open the floor up for questions if you have those. Tell us a little bit about EPPC and what the vision and mission of the organization is, and a little bit more about your role there.
Sure. The Ethics and Public Policy Center is a think tank in Washington, D.C. Long established, George Weigel and Ed Whalen, Pete Wehner. And we take a Judeo-Christian values approach to burning questions of public policy. So we take all these foundational principles that have made our country great on the faith and moral questions and apply it through scholarship and research to legislation, public policy, legal cases, etc. It's vital. It's vital because if you exclude religion from the public square, America is made for a moral and religious people. It's not fit for any other, right? Those are words from our founders. So we need to have that vital voice in the public square. And I'm the director of the HHS Accountability Project, where we specifically focused on HHS, which we called the Department of Life under Trump. And one important thing to notice, in the strategic plan, we made clear that we defend the health and well-being of all Americans from conception until natural death. That's what we put in as an official federal policy. And I'm not sure they've undone that yet. And I don't think they're going to undo every single thing. We did so many things, and we put it in so many places. And I'm hearing from folks who are still on the inside that they're frustrated by how good a job we did, because it is hard to undo a lot of the things. But now we're on the outside exposing when they do wrong. And unfortunately, it's a booming business for us right now.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Questions? Yes, sir.
Do you foresee any possibility that the current Supreme Court will go back under the First Amendment and establish a requirement that the government show a compelling state interest or compelling government interest before denying religious freedom?
So that's the Employment Division versus Smith case. It was a case by Scalia who said that effectively, if you have a law that applies for everybody, then even if it burdens religion, tough luck, you got to play by the same rules. It has some surface appeal. Disaster for religious freedom, though. Congress responded with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, almost unanimous. President Clinton signed it into law. It's a super statute that puts the same test of compelling burden. You have to have a really, really, really good reason to burden somebody's religion, even if it's neutral. Compelling interest is something that would justify racial discrimination by the government. That's how high a bar it is. I'm hopeful that Smith will be overturned. It may happen sooner than we think. There are some cases out there that are percolating, and I think we might have 5 votes to do it, and that would be a godsend. We did this in HHS. We used that same test, the higher burden test. We protected adoption agencies that were religious, who would only place children in their care with families that followed their biblical views of man-woman marriage, provided them those exemptions. They're likely going to be rolled back, we'll see. But we were required by law to do it. And the fact that we said there was no compelling interest in forcing these religious institutions to violate their beliefs is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's going to be very hard for the Biden administration to suddenly say, oh, now we found a compelling interest, because now the government's speaking out of both sides of its mouth. So those are some of the things we did that are a bit of a one-way ratchet. The left has had many one-way ratchets. We found one for the conservative side, so hopefully it'll play out well. And this would all be unnecessary if the Supreme Court undoes Smith, which I'm mightily in favor of.
Thank you. Very good question. Other questions? Oh, my goodness. Yes, sir.
Maybe a couple comments and a question. Number one is, you've got to know God gave you that voice.
Oh, thank you. It gave me this voice and a face for radio, apparently.
You left the faith for a while, I don't know. You've got to stay with us from now on. The second
I'm not going anywhere.
comment was, I've only heard one other voice that has done that much for me in all these years.
Oh, thank you. That is an incredibly high compliment. Thank you.
Well, you deserve it.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Where do you think we are right now when we talk about health, as far as the mental health of our children and social media? What can we do to prohibit what they're bombarded with?
Yes, I'm in favor of regulating social media companies. And this breaks with the more libertarian streak on the right. But they are more powerful than government when it comes to shaping culture and controlling the means of communication. It may take legislation to do it. There are some precedents in court I'm a fan of. I've actually written on this. And by the way, you could follow me on Twitter and follow me on EPPC to see some of the articles I've written. And help me on Twitter. There's some nasty people. All the comments, it's just, yeah. Okay, don't go on Twitter except to help me. That's one thing, because Twitter is toxic. So some form of regulation there's some what's called company town precedents, where if a company controlled all aspects of civic life, then the Constitution effectively applied, because you can't carve out a space in America where the laws just don't apply, right? And the tech world is carving out so much space in America where the laws just don't apply, because it's one person, Zuckerberg, one person, he controls the majority stake of Facebook. And that controls so much of our information flow. I mean, the censorship on anything having to do with vaccines, and even when they're flat out wrong, and they have to reverse course later, even when Facebook is wrong, is what I'm saying. So that's one aspect. Regulation through congressional action is another. And the duty of parents as the primary educators of their kids to limit their screen time access, or just know what they're doing when they're doing it.
Okay. We've got, let's see, 2 final questions. Cindy?
President Biden tries to hack the Supreme Court. Do you think he would be successful in that?
No. I think he's got a snowball's chance of packing the Supreme Court. He's trying right now with this kangaroo commission to give him some sort of cover to start trying to change the Overton window, trying to get the issue out there in order to give him cover to try to intimidate the Supreme Court. He doesn't have the votes in the Senate to do it. It's absolutely just a power play to try to pressure the court, because that's the last institution of government that he doesn't control. The left controls so much: academia, media, law firms, the administrative state, the presidency and Congress. They don't have the courts. So what's left? Intimidate. So they're going to try to discredit the court as much as they can, because the court's going to do some good things in the coming days. But realistically, it would be political suicide for them to try, because the next time there's a switch in power, guess what's going to happen? They're going to restack the court the other way. And one of the reasons we got such a good Supreme Court and so many good members of the cabinet under Trump was because one party got rid of the filibuster rule for judges. And, well, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And now we got some great Supreme Court justices as a result. I don't believe in unilateral disarmament at all. So if one side does it within bounds, there's some ethical bounds, we can't cross certain lines, but there's a whole lot of space, right? I mean, I founded a division after I saw them found all sorts of divisions of bad stuff. I wanted to find a division of good stuff. That's what we did.
Okay. And final question, Courtney.
Yeah, we had a question just about the mandates. I appreciate you talking about that. We have a small medical office, so we're under the 100 employee rule. But we do get medical funding through Medicaid and Medicare. Is there anything we can do to like protect our employees who don't want to do vaccine, or, I mean, what recourse, like our friends and family who don't want to do the vaccine, do they have, or do
Yeah.
Americans have a recourse if
There is some.
they don't? Okay.
So there's, first step, what can be done about the mandate, especially if you're an employer who wants to protect your employees? What recourse do you have? Right now, the rule, the OSHA rule, has not gone into effect yet. There have to be lawsuits the minute it goes into effect. Well, the minute they try to put it into effect, to block it from going into effect. The best test case are people who have already had COVID, because it is flatly irrational to say if you've already had COVID, you must be vaccinated, when evidence shows that if you have the antibodies, you are at the same or better in terms of risk profile of getting it and passing it on than a person who's vaccinated. So find those contradictions and use those as a test case. File the religious exemptions if you're sincere and you have them, and the resources. I know Liberty Counsel has one. I know First Liberty Institute has a toolkit. I've been helping so many people, friends who are in this boat, who are about to be fired. And it is tragic when people, especially in the healthcare space, who were hailed as heroes last year, heroes because they were wearing their masks, and they weren't being labeled threats because they weren't threats. But now they're being labeled as threats because they're not following the latest dictate and mandate. And this is how upside down it's gotten. There's a story of a doctor who refuses to take patients who are not vaccinated. Rather than not be treated than treat somebody who's not vaccinated, even if they present no risk or very limited risk. I mean, they're willing to mask. A clinic that was issuing COVID tests refused to give a test to somebody who was outspoken against the mandates. How does that make any sense to anybody? This person was willing to take a test to follow the rules, but was outspoken publicly. It's because it's ideological, right? Something else is going on, and that's why I raised it in the context of religious freedom. When something else is going on at that level, remember all those revolutions I talked about? It's that same sort of spirit that animated those sorts of things, and they lead to a very, very dark place. So when the time comes, if it does, there have to be lawsuits and other forms of resisting, because we can't just let it slide. We can't. There's just far too much at stake.
So for small businesses, do we just wait? Do we just wait and see, or then try to join one of the laws?
Yes, until the mandate actually comes to you, and it could be your state doing it. I don't know what's going on here, but until the mandate comes, it's best to wait, but it's best to have the right test case. But absolutely be ready. That's one thing, is all of you should come to a understanding of what's at stake. People aren't going to be able to hide from these issues. Somebody you know is going to be impacted in a deep, deep way. And if it doesn't impact you now, a couple years down the road, it will. So I really encourage you all to take the vaccine question very, very seriously.
Roger, thank you so much. We're so grateful for your time, for your wisdom, for your service. Appreciate it.